not one, but a huge chunk of emerging economies are commodity-driven, okay? And so therefore, and that's not China, that's not India, but that's Brazil, that's much of Africa, that's Argentina, Venezuela, and so on. So therefore, that's Russia. So the emerging economies that are commodity-driven, they, of course, benefit from growing demand for commodities and suffer when the demand for commodities goes into a slump. So therefore, it can be both positive or negative, depending on what's happening to growth rate in the rich economies and, of course, growth rate also in China. Another thing that affects economies around the world, and emerging economies in particular, because they depend on external capital, are the effects of quantitative easing, whether it's by US or Europe or Japan, and so on, etc. So obviously, when the Fed follows an easy money policy, that's a plus for emerging economies. But when the tapering begins to, or the quantitative easing begins to end, that sends shivers through the emerging economies. So that's another big factor which cuts across. Another factor that cuts across is technology. And again, there are parts of technology revolution that are massively plus for emerging economies, parts that are not, in fact, plus for at least many of the emerging economies, particularly if you look at shale oil and gas. And so what the shale revolution has done is, increase very dramatically the supply of oil and gas in a context where actually among the rich economies, the demand for oil and gas has been shrinking. And so therefore, if you are an economy that is based very heavily on oil and gas, you are seriously affected in a negative way by that technology revolution. On the other hand, if you look at broadband mobile, cheap smartphones, tablets, and so on, etc., what that technology revolution, what it does, it brings connectedness, it brings access to knowledge, access to education, access to Khan Academy and Coursera and the like to billions of people around the world, so that they no longer have to depend on the government to open physical schools and have real live human beings as teachers. Now that the self-education becomes a real possibility at a very accelerated pace. And just to look at the negative effect of the shale revolution, this is an interesting statement that Mr. Putin made, almost like 2 years back. He says, for many years, we had a situation when prices for our main export goods were doing very well. But this situation has changed, and no simple solutions and no magic wand that can change things overnight. So he understood the reality very well, and one wonders, in fact, if he said, well, if we can't economically find a solution for Russia's greatness, let's find some other solutions to establish Russia's greatness. But he recognizes the economic challenges. One might argue, of course, that he has made the economic situation worse for Russia through the actions that he has taken over the last 18 months or so. But you can see the direct impact of the shale revolution on the fate of emerging economies that depend on oil and gas. In terms of the internet, broadband, technology, and of course, these pictures convey some of that development that's taking place. So these are kind of broad brush effects. But then there are kind of what I say next level, meso level, micro level effects, which vary from country to country. China, of course, is the giant among emerging economies. China is slowing down. And that's a secular slowdown. It's not going to come back. The days of 8, 9, 10% are gone forever. And so that affects China, but it also affects the fate of commodity suppliers, not just suppliers of oil and gas, suppliers of iron ore and copper and so on. Whatever commodity except for foodstuff, but whatever, metals and mining and so on, those commodities, they affect. So therefore, China's slowdown is negative for commodity exporters, but positive actually for commodity importers like India. Okay, so therefore the slowdown in commodity prices is not across the board a negative for emerging economies. Then there is a neighborhood effect. Over the last 1 year, I've been to Africa to give talks several times. I've been to Nigeria, I've been to South Africa, and so on. And it's interesting that when you sit down, talk to CEOs and so on, etc., they're kind of comparing, South Africa to other African economies, or Nigeria to other African economies. But you go to Indonesia, they don't compare Indonesia to Africa. They compare Indonesia to China or to Southeast Asia or to India. So there is the neighborhood effect, and that neighborhood effect can have seriously important implications because India, for example, it's like China constantly compares itself to the US. Who does India constantly compare itself to is China. As Anand Mahindra, one of the billionaires and industrialists of India, he said some time back, for a country that invented yoga, India did not learn to stretch unless China forced it to. So there is a neighborhood effect. And to the extent that China sits in the middle of Asia, that neighborhood effect is good for Asian economies. By the same token, there isn't a China equivalent in Africa, so therefore that's not necessarily a good. There isn't an equivalent like that in Latin America. You have Brazil, but Brazil isn't really a showcase of a well-managed economy, and so on. So there is a neighborhood effect. Of course, there is complacency. Is that from 1990 to 2010, as emerging economies did very well. So complacency set in. It's like as if it's leadership's genius that made it happen. Of course, that complacency set in India too. So it's so that can be, and again, it doesn't have to set in. There are countries that were emerging markets at one time, and to me, the shining example of a country that was an emerging market but is no longer justifies being called one is South Korea. In the mid-1980s, South Korea was roughly where China is now. And essentially, my analysis of South Korea is that the leadership there, if you think of a country that goes berserk, that goes mad in a good way, is that they found themselves potentially trapped between a high-tech Japan and low-cost China. And so therefore, they might have essentially concluded that South Korea is done for. Its good days are over. Now, of course, how do you overcome that situation? You can go back and become poor so you can compete with China on low cost. But that's not necessarily a very pleasant alternative. So therefore, what's a good alternative? They said we are going to outcompete Japan on R&D. And what South Korea did, of course, they're blessed with a strong education system and a culture that's absolutely mad about education, particularly STEM. But what South Korea also did is to ramp up its R&D to GDP ratio to, in fact, 3.5%, when the global average is 2.5 and Europe is below 2 and Japan is around 3. And so essentially, that's what South Korea did. So it's possible not to get complacent from what you have accomplished, but there are also many countries that have gone complacent. You look at Goodluck Jonathan, who just got ousted in Nigeria. You look at Zuma in Africa. You look at the Congress government that got ousted last year in India. And then, of course, leadership, which leadership and complacency are kind of interconnected. So it does make a difference as to who the leader is in India or in Indonesia or in Brazil. So there is the leadership effect, etc. So now, if you look at the trajectory, if you look at the EM10, so here I ordered them in terms of per capita incomes. So it's not by size of population or size of GDP, but by per capita income, because actually it tells an interesting story. And again, interesting story of divergence among the EM10. So you look at the per capita income, so we can say Argentina and Russia are sort of higher end of middle income, okay? All of these are middle income economies, according to World Bank. None is low income. But India is lower middle income, whereas Russia or Poland or Argentina would be upper middle income. China is sort of smack middle, right? Then you look at, of course, population, GDP size, and so on, etc. It's interesting to look at the growth rates. So if you look at growth rate, from 2000 to 2010, you look at 2010 to 2013, you can see actually is that the richer the economy on a per capita income basis, the slower the growth rate has been over the last 13 years, right? Now, in one sense, of course, you can say, well, that's natural, right? Because there is a base level effect. If you are lower income, it's easier to grow at a faster pace. That's true. And so that's one conclusion one could derive from here. But another conclusion that one would derive from here is that actually still, even Argentina, Russia, Poland, Brazil, etc., they are still middle-income economies. They are not rich economies. The story is not over for them, okay? And so they still have to work very hard to become rich economies. They cannot be complacent. But what it takes for the upper middle-income economies to become rich is fundamentally different from what it takes to go from low income to lower middle income, or to go from lower middle income to middle or upper middle, and so on. So the challenges for the upper level of this 10 are different. And it's not clear that many of the leaders recognize those challenges. At the same time, the challenges for countries like India, like Nigeria, like Indonesia are very different, okay? Which is basically infrastructure. It's like what China did, okay? That's what India needs to do with madness. And if India doesn't need to do, or doesn't do that, or Indonesia or Nigeria, they'll basically stay stuck. But on the other hand, China cannot continue to play the same game over the next 15 years, what it played over the last 30 years, because that's not going to get China from middle to upper middle or to high income. So the game that needs to be played varies significantly. Also, if you look at, this is latest data, April 2015, IMF World Economic Outlook updates, and so on. So what the IMF is saying in terms of projected numbers is that actually here I cannot see fully or properly, but you can see actually there are certain countries where the numbers don't look very good. So you look at Argentina, you look at Russia, you look at Brazil, where you look at Turkey, okay, I cannot see the numbers here, but essentially it's a story of really not a particularly good trends, okay? And so the leaders of these countries need to rethink the game that they are playing. And of these, Russia and Turkey are definitely they're among the bigger economies. And Brazil, you look at what's happening in Brazil with all the Petrobras and all the scandals and what Dilma is doing. So Brazil has serious challenges on its hands, okay, right now. China is a very different story, because in China, essentially what it is, they played the infrastructure game very well. That's precisely what God might have said you should do. But then if China continues to play that game, it has to build bridges to nowhere now. You look at already what's happening to property prices. You look at what's happening to investment. And so essentially as the government now engages in more easing in China, it's not, the numbers don't tell us that that's going into more investment. That's basically going into more speculation on the stock market. And so while the economy is slowing down, the Chinese stock market is actually, doing very well, etc. So again, China needs to play a different game. The challenges for Indonesia, in Nigeria, and India are actually very different, right? India is a powerhouse in technology in many ways. But at the same time, while technology and particularly IT and all of that gives India a good brand image, in terms of moving the needle regarding India's GDP, the IT and the services sector basically is really a tiny portion. Okay, its impact on the economy is tiny, its impact on the brand image is huge. So if we are talking about India's economy, GDP as a whole, lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, etc., that really has to be done by doing what China did, is to create low-skilled manufacturing jobs that require, that's not IT, that's not a services game, that's infrastructure and manufacturing game. And that's why actually I'm very, very positive about Modi's, the new Prime Minister of India since last year, his Make in India campaign. Because now, of course, there are many challenges in making that campaign a reality, but at least he gets it. So that's, now of course I have lots of stuff where I go into details of various factors, economic structure, the infrastructure quality, financial institutions, public institutions, the quality of education. So I look at these various numbers, but I'm also looking at the time, and I think it will be good to have some dialogue. So maybe what I will do, I will stop at this point so we can have some Q&A. Thank you very much. Please.
So I didn't expect you to stop there, but you mentioned the Make in India campaign. Prior to the opening up in the early 90s, India made a lot of things in India, but they didn't trade external to India, if I'm correct. So they low quality, low innovation. When they opened up, a lot of those domestic firms went to the floor. And you talked about Korea and competing with Japan as opposed to going low end on China. So with the Make India campaign, where does India fit in? Do they compete with maybe Korea and Japan, or are they competing for making low quality goods for other emerging markets?
Yeah. So you see, the whether it's Make in India or Make in China, Make in South Korea, Make in anywhere campaigns, etc., the basic story in my view is that if you're a small economy, then the Make in X, let's call the small economy X. If it's a small economy, then the Make in X, like say Taiwan, for example, relatively speaking, small economy, then the Make in X has to be largely export driven. But if you're a large economy, like China, like India, the Make in China, Make in India is only peripherally an export story. Bulk of it is a domestic story. China, we know, is the world's export powerhouse. But it is an export powerhouse because we see Chinese consumer goods at Walmart or other places. But if we actually look at the numbers, right? And so China's exports to GDP are about 20%. And if we work all the numbers, but of course, of that exports, some of it is what's called processed trade. So if the components come in from Taiwan or South Korea or Japan, and they get assembled into an iPhone. So the value added within China is not 100% of that 20%. It's actually less than half. Estimates are 40, 50%. So of China's GDP, about 10% of the GDP, 10%, maybe 12%, these numbers are not exact, is actually export-based, export-driven value added. If you look at the growth rates, of the 10% growth rate in China's GDP from 2000 to 2013, roughly about 1.5% of that, 1.5% to 2% in that range, came from growth in exports. The remaining 8.5% to 9% of China's GDP growth was in fact driven very heavily by manufacturing, but that was manufacturing for domestic consumption within China. So therefore, similarly for India, that Make in India is hugely important, but I wouldn't sweat about who does India compete with on the global scale in terms of exports, even if India's exports of manufactured goods are zero. Of course, that will hurt, but the hurt will be at the margins. Bulk of the Make in India value added will have to be, irrespective of what happens on exports, by domestic consumption. No, because you see, India's labor costs are in fact quite it's significantly lower than China's. And so if India builds its so India's labor costs are low, India's education level is decent, India's managerial capabilities, engineering capabilities are very strong. What India has extreme weakness in is infrastructure. If the government begins to fix infrastructure, there is no reason why for most goods, of course, if it's aircraft and things like that, yes, of course, there will be things that India will need to import because it's not yet capable of doing that domestically. But for most goods, whether it's appliances or shoes or textiles or electrical goods or assembly of iPhones and the iPads and the smartphones and so on, etc., there's no reason to believe that the multinationals would think it is more competitive to import into India. They would say, why don't we set up manufacturing in India, right? So I would advocate, really India should not close down its borders because India has the possibility to become a manufacturing powerhouse.
Hi. So, Anil, with your projections for 2025 of emerging markets becoming more than... but there's a big if behind, which is keeping this growth rate. And my concern, without wanting to be the Malthusian in the room, natural resources. So if we're talking about 82% of the population growing at 5% per year, we never had this type of scale of growth. So natural resources, one extra car in Beijing, Delhi, or São Paulo is already one car too many. There is no, it's not only logistic infrastructure, but it's also environmental problems, etc. So I see that, though, I would see your projections too optimistic if we think on the natural resources side and the challenges to grow at that rate for 82% of the population.
That's right. Yeah, I think it's an extremely important question, Paulo. But I would say, of course, whenever we are talking about the future, it's not smart to make a single point projection because it's a spectrum of possibilities. But on that spectrum, this Malthusian kind of scenario is one possibility. But I can hopefully, with high confidence, build other scenarios. But start from, for example, back in 1968, I forget the author's name right now, there was a bestseller book called The Population Bomb. And in fact, the author made the argument that by the late 1970s, hundreds of millions of people in the world will be dying of starvation. Okay, because you look at the land is fixed and water is fixed, but population is growing. But unless, of course, the governments did a phenomenal job of censoring, I did not read that hundreds of millions of people died of starvation. Essentially, what happened is that agricultural productivity leapt up. And not only that, but also as people became wealthier and people became more educated, population growth rates started shrinking. And so therefore that problem never happened. So for example, I was discussing very recently with one of the people who analyzes the car industry. And I was looking at the future of the car industry. And of course, if the auto penetration in China or India were to be, or Latin America were to be like, the US, that means what happens to the environment and what happens to road congestion and what happens to the demand for steel and tires and everything else, right? So that's one scenario. But of course, another scenario is you have mass transit. And so auto ownership doesn't need to be anything like what we see in the US. But not only that, actually what the auto analyst said, that among his circles, they do not rule out the possibility that the Uber effect essentially spreads and spreads and spreads. And even in rich economies, auto penetration essentially starts shrinking. And so therefore, one can build other scenarios that are also very credible. And so right now, maybe it's my first degree, which was in engineering. So I remain a techno-optimist, and I'm not ready to give up, throw up my hands on that.